There is a kind of fatigue that doesn't show on the face but lives in the eyes. It's the exhaustion of those who tried too hard to understand, to endure, to love. And in the end, they realized that all the effort changed nothing. It only emptied them from within. You've felt it too, haven't you? That silent sensation of being present everywhere, yet noticed nowhere, of offering safety, listening, and presence, yet being treated as if none of it had any weight. The modern man isn't drained from a lack of love. He's exhausted from investing emotionally without ever receiving anything in return. He tries to be the safe harbor, firm, steady, reliable. But what he doesn't realize is that, in many cases, he becomes the anchor that drags him down. Because the harder he tries to be needed, the more invisible he becomes. And the more he tries to prove himself, the more he loses the mystery that once made him fascinating. His exhaustion isn't physical, it's spiritual. It begins the moment he understands that love, the way he learned it, is a silent battlefield, and he is always the soldier who cannot retreat. Men like this carry within them a deep fear. The fear of being emotionally useless, of giving everything and still not being chosen, of being remembered only for their utility, never for their presence. That's why so many of them fall silent, not because they have nothing to say, but because they've learned that expressing what they feel usually pushes away those they're trying to keep close. A woman asks for vulnerability, but when he shows it, she sees him as weak. She asks for empathy, but when he offers it, she finds him predictable. And so he learns, in the cruelest way, that his emotional world is not a safe place to inhabit. The result is silence. A dense silence, heavier than the body can bear. He doesn't complain, confront, or explain. He simply withdraws little by little, trying to preserve what remains of himself. But that withdrawal isn't peace, it's surrender. Think about it. How many times have you found yourself awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling your heart heavy without knowing why? It's not the job, it's not the routine, it's the exhaustion of trying to sustain a bond that only exists because you keep pushing it alone. You've become the foundation of a house no one lives in anymore. The emotionally exhausted man is a master of containment. He holds back tears, anger, doubt, fear. He manages his emotions like a man managing a fire, trying not to let the flames reveal him. But the soul feels, and the body demands payment, because prolonged silence turns repressed emotion into symptoms: irritation, fatigue, apathy, detachment. The cruelest part is that no one notices, because he still works, still smiles, still fulfills his obligations. Society applauds him for staying strong, without realizing that what they call strength is, in fact, a form of disguised resignation, a resignation from being understood. It's like wearing armor made of empathy. It protects, but it weighs. That image defines perfectly the man who feels everything but can show nothing. He learned to be everyone's shelter, and because of that, he never had a place to rest. And slowly, something inside him changes. He stops trying to be the good guy, stops proving his worth through emotional sacrifice. He begins to realize that the more he tries to be useful, the less he's desired. And that confuses him, because all he ever did was love the way he was taught to. But love born from the need for validation is the same love that destroys the soul. Because when you love to be validated, every absence becomes a wound. Every silence becomes rejection. Every cold gesture becomes proof of failure. That's how many men fall ill without even realizing it. Emotional exhaustion is invisible, but it's devastating. It corrodes joy, desire, and presence. And while trying to stay whole, the man quietly breaks apart. The fear of being emotionally useless drives him to do more, but the more he does, the less he is seen. He believes constant presence creates security, when in truth, it creates complacency. A woman stops feeling his impact because he's always there, available, predictable, accessible, and nothing constant ever stirs desire. This is the paradox of male exhaustion. The harder he tries to hold the bond, the more it frays. The more he shows, the more she drifts away. The more he gives, the more he loses himself. But this fatigue isn't only born from relationships. It's born from a pattern, the belief that love must be earned through effort, that affection must be deserved. And that keeps him trapped in a childish illusion that if he does everything right, he'll be rewarded. But mature love doesn't function as a reward. It's drawn to integrity, not insistence. Exhaustion, then, is the soul's silent cry saying, "Stop trying to be everything." Because the man who tries to be everything for someone inevitably stops being something for himself. And when that happens, his masculinity becomes weight, not presence. He is no longer the center of his emotional field. He's a visitor in his own life. There is sacred strength in a man who recognizes his own limit, not the limit of giving up, but the limit of dignity. That moment when he realizes that loving too much can also be a way of abandoning himself. And that being good when it costs your own energy is just an elegant form of self-destruction. The silence of tired men is, at its core, a plea for a new beginning. A beginning where love isn't a test, but a choice. Where effort isn't sacrifice, but a natural expression of presence. Where the man stops being the guardian of the bond and becomes the guardian of himself. Because in the end, true exhaustion isn't love itself. It's loving without return, without recognition, without reciprocity. It's sustaining a bond that has lost its pulse, and still insisting because giving up feels like betrayal. But there comes a point when continuing is the same as bleeding in silence, and that's when the soul begins to ask for a pause, not to give up on love, but to remember who it was before trying to be everything for someone else. That's the beginning of awakening, the moment when the tired man finally hears what his body and silence have been trying to tell him all along, that loving too much is not virtue. It's exhaustion disguised as devotion. There is a subtle difference between loving and trying to be needed, and many men cross that line without realizing it, believing that the more generous they are, the more they'll be loved. But love, when born from the urge to prove worth, becomes emotional servitude. The emotionally exhausted man is the one who learned to negotiate affection through effort. He believes that if he is patient, understanding, and attentive, he will finally be recognized. But this is a silent contract that only he signed. On the other side stands someone who grew accustomed to receiving everything, without ever needing to give anything in return. That is the invisible trap of emotional generosity. It becomes a refined form of self-abandonment. The more he gives, the more she expects. The more he adjusts, the more she drifts away. And without realizing it, he begins to believe that being loved is a matter of merit, not reciprocity. But true love is not a negotiation. It is presence, not performance. The man who gives too much believes that by healing her pain, he'll be seen as indispensable. But the Savior's addiction makes him predictable. He confuses empathy with mission, presence with responsibility. And in doing so, he loses the mystery, the same mystery that once sparked her desire. He tries to be the hero who fixes, soothes, supports, heals, but what he doesn't see is that by trying to heal her pain, he disconnects from his own. He starts living at her emotional frequency instead of his, and with each act of saving, he sinks deeper into his own fatigue. When he realizes that nothing he does is enough, the first rupture happens, not with her but within himself. He begins to feel small, disposable, even pathetic for caring so much. That's when desire begins to die, not because she changed, but because he dissolved. Predictability kills magnetism, and magnetism without contrast fades. The erosion of desire is silent. A woman stops feeling his vibration, not because she lost interest, but because he lost his pulse. He has become too stable, too available, too emotionally resolved, and paradoxically that makes him invisible. What once felt like strength now seems like a need for approval. What was once calm now sounds like weakness, and he doesn't understand, because he's done everything he was told a good man should do. Listen, support, be present. But no one told him that too much presence kills mystery, and that emotional predictability is the greatest enemy of female desire. His false sense of control keeps him trapped. He believes that if he's patient enough, if he speaks the right way, if he adapts one more time, she'll finally see his value. But what she feels is the opposite. The more he molds himself, the less she perceives him. Because desire doesn't come from control, it comes from contrast, from space, from the tension between what is given and what is withheld. This is the paradox of masculine energy. When he tries to control the emotional bond, he loses the inner authority that made him magnetic. Authority cannot be earned through insistence. It's recognized when he remains whole, even in the face of rejection. But the emotionally exhausted man no longer knows where empathy ends and self-sabotage begins. He confuses connection with convenience, presence with neediness. And while trying to be indispensable, he becomes increasingly replaceable. Every time you try to be needed, you become replaceable. That is the invisible law that governs the modern emotional game. When a man puts himself in the role of the one who always gives, he becomes part of the background, predictable as air, steady as the floor. And what is too steady, no matter how valuable, ceases to be felt. The cost of constant presence is the loss of perception. Absence, on the other hand, reignites remembrance. The feminine mind moves by contrast. She must feel the absence to perceive the value. But the tired man fears absence, believing that distance means the end. What he doesn't see is that sometimes distance is what rekindles desire. Emotional presence only has power when it comes from choice, not obligation. And the man who gives unconsciously ceases to be a choice. He becomes a resource. That's why she stops seeing him. Not because she stopped loving him, but because he no longer represents emotional challenge. She already knows how he reacts, what he thinks, what he feels. And the mystery that once drew her in has been replaced by predictability. This is the root of exhaustion. He tries to be everything and therefore stops being something. Generosity without limits turns into fear. Fear of losing, fear of being rejected, fear of not being enough. And that fear generates the very energy that repels what he's trying to keep close. A woman feels when a man loves from lack. She can't explain it, but she senses it. And that kind of love doesn't inspire her, it burdens her. Feminine desire needs to feel the presence of a man who loves himself more than he needs to be loved. A man who gives but doesn't surrender entirely, who embraces but doesn't erase himself. The exhaustion of emotional generosity doesn't come from too much love, but from lack of awareness. When a man loves without perceiving himself, he gets lost inside the bond. He starts to confuse doing good with being necessary, and he believes that if he stops doing, he'll stop being loved. But it's the opposite. When he stops trying, that's when he starts to be felt. Healing begins when he understands that love isn't a transaction. It's presence with boundaries. And boundaries aren't absence, they're respect. They're the line that separates what he offers from what he preserves. A man who doesn't preserve himself is never seen as an emotional leader. And without emotional leadership, the bond loses the polarity that sustains desire. He must learn to remove the excess without removing affection, to offer less presence but more intensity, less explanation, more silence. Because silence, when it comes from a whole man, isn't indifference, it's magnetism. A woman in front of such a man feels something she can't name, a mixture of respect, curiosity, and desire, because he's no longer trying to prove anything, he simply is, and that's what makes him visible again. In the end, the exhaustion of emotional generosity teaches a hard but liberating lesson. No one values what they don't have to earn. And when you give yourself too easily, the other stops moving toward you. It's movement that creates connection, not unilateral effort. The man who gives with awareness becomes rare. The one who gives out of fear becomes predictable, and what is predictable, no matter how noble, stops being desired. Exhaustion, then, is the silent signal that it's time to retreat, not to offer more, but to rebuild. To remember that love isn't a test of endurance, it's a mirror of presence. And when a man finally understands this, he begins to reclaim the power he always had, the power to be felt, even in silence. Emotional exhaustion carries a price that the body silently collects. First comes irritation without reason, then a lack of energy. Later, the disinterest in things that once brought pleasure. A man doesn't notice the exact moment he stops feeling. He simply gets used to the numbness. He starts waking up tired even after sleeping. He begins to prefer isolation over company. not because he wants to be alone, but because he no longer has the strength to sustain his own presence. This is the invisible collapse, when the body starts protesting for all the words that were never spoken. For too long he believed that endurance was virtue, that swallowing pain was a sign of maturity. But the body doesn't obey pride. It finds its own way to speak, through insomnia, unexplained pain, lack of focus, and constant discouragement. It's the silent scream of the soul, begging to be heard. Irritability is the first symptom of a compressed soul. It isn't anger at others, it's anger at himself, for having given too much, for having stayed silent when he should have stood firm, for staying when everything already called for departure. It's the body saying, "I can't take this contained version of me anymore." The emotionally exhausted man no longer feels joy in anything, not in work, not in touch, not even in daily life. He isn't clinically depressed. He's saturated with being useful, strong, pretending everything's fine. His soul craves rest, but his ego insists on going on. Emotional anesthesia is the most dangerous stage of exhaustion because it creates the illusion of normality. He thinks he's fine, that he's just matured, when in truth he's disconnected from his own essence. He no longer feels anger, joy, or desire. Life becomes a sequence of completed tasks, without soul, without pulse. And it shows in the body. The breathing becomes shallow, the gaze empty, the touch lifeless. He still makes love but doesn't connect, still talks but doesn't communicate, still lives but doesn't exist. It's the state of emotional survival, where everything functions but nothing flows. Sexual exhaustion is a direct reflection of emotional overload. Desire doesn't fade because he's aging, but because the body can't serve a tired heart anymore. Sexual energy is vital. When a man uses it only to compensate for emotional frustration, the body shuts the system down for self-protection. Instinct quiets because pleasure has stopped being an expression of life and become an act of escape. The loss of masculine identity begins there. He stops seeing himself as a man and starts seeing himself as a function, a provider, a partner, a conflict mediator, a caretaker. But not as a whole, passionate, alive man. And when he reduces himself to function, he loses the spark that sustained desire, his and hers. He asks himself, "What happened to me?" But the answer is simple, though painful. He stopped being the protagonist of his own energy. He traded presence for predictability, instinct for reason, desire for duty. And the body, in its wisdom, defends itself by shutting down emotions that have become too heavy to bear. Retreating into silence becomes his last refuge. He doesn't speak anymore, not because he doesn't want to, but because he's already tried. And every time he did, he was misunderstood. His vulnerability was called weakness, his fatigue, coldness, his sincerity drama, so he learned to go quiet. But his silence isn't peace, it's exile. A man who isn't heard begins to disappear little by little, even from himself. That disappearance doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual. He begins to withdraw from conversations, from relationships, from his own dreams, until one day he realizes he's there, but not there. He functions, but doesn't live. And that's the point where many lose their direction without ever noticing. The body tries to warn him, constant fatigue, discouragement, lack of libido, irritability. But the modern man ignores these signs because he was taught to see weakness in any display of limit. He believes being a man means enduring everything, but the body doesn't seek resistance, it seeks presence. And presence only exists when emotion is heard, not repressed. The invisible collapse is the result of years of emotional self-abandonment, not because he lacks heart, but because he's always used it for others. The body at that point isn't failing, it's trying to save what's left. It gets sick, not to punish, but to awaken. Because only when the body speaks does the man start to hear what the heart always knew. He's exhausted from living just to be accepted. Healing doesn't come from closing off, it comes from reconnecting. And reconnection begins when he stops pretending everything's fine. When he accepts that exhaustion isn't weakness, it's a limit screaming for awareness. When he realizes that it's not the world draining him, but the imbalance between giving and receiving, between loving and preserving himself. The anger that follows won't be the enemy. It will be the first sign that he's feeling again, because before anger, there was only apathy. And apathy is the opposite of life. When he starts to feel irritation again, he shouldn't feel guilty. He should be grateful. It's the body coming back to vibrancy. The man who listens to his own body regains the power to rise again. He realizes that a tired heart isn't the end. It's the beginning of clarity. And that clarity allows him to see that the love he lacked most was his own. Exhaustion, deep down, doesn't want destruction. It wants pause. It wants true silence, not the silence of repression, but the silence of restoration. It wants space for the man to feel his own rhythm again, his own desire, his own life. Because the body doesn't want to be a hero. It just wants to be home again. And when he starts listening to this body, its rhythm, its breath, its fatigue, its unspoken truths, something shifts. Energy starts flowing again. His gaze regains presence. And the silence that once was escape becomes strength. That's the moment when the man begins to understand that exhaustion isn't the end of the road. It's the sign that it's time to come back home to himself. There comes a moment when silence stops protecting and starts suffocating. It's when a man, after swallowing for too long, finally explodes, not out of aggression, but out of despair. At that point, anger isn't the opposite of love. It's wounded love trying to survive. It's the cry of a man who has tried to be understood in every possible language and was ignored in them all. For a long time, he believed that calmness meant wisdom, that controlling emotions was a sign of strength. But what he didn't see was that excessive calmness had become a prison. He learned to hold so much inside that his own body began to rebel against the silence. And anger, the emotion he feared most, becomes the only proof that something alive still burns within him. Anger is vital energy. It's the fire trying to rekindle what complacency has extinguished. When used consciously, it doesn't destroy. It illuminates. But when repressed, it rots inside and corrodes the soul in the form of irritation, guilt, and resentment. That's why the man who denies his anger never finds peace. He merely changes the name of his poison. The emotionally exhausted man eventually reaches a point where he can no longer play the mediator. He grows tired of being the peacemaker, the one who understands everything, the one who gives in for the sake of harmony. Because deep down, harmony never existed, only his fear of being misunderstood. And that fear castrated him. It cut off instinct. It suppressed the natural impulse to defend himself. But every repressed instinct eventually returns as an explosion. And when it does, the world calls him aggressive, when in truth he's only screaming what he was forced to silence. Anger isn't the enemy. The real enemy is the conditioning that taught him to fear his own strength. Since childhood, men have been taught that expressing anger is toxic, immature, violent, and so they became docile. Controlled men, but deeply disconnected from their power. The docility that once protected them emotionally now makes them impotent. Because a man who represses anger also represses clarity, and without clarity, he no longer knows where his limits are. That's where the danger of repression lies. He loses his internal compass. He doesn't know when something hurts him, manipulates him, drains him. He keeps smiling while bleeding, trying to maintain the image of balance. But balance isn't the absence of conflict. It's knowing when to say enough. And anger, when listened to with awareness, is the emotion that points to that boundary. When a man reconnects with his anger, he reconnects with himself. Not with destructive anger, but with lucid anger. The kind that carries no hate, only truth. The kind that says, I've given enough. I've stayed quiet long enough. Now that's enough. That enough isn't violence, it's sovereignty. It's the moment when a man stops seeking acceptance and begins to respect himself. Contained masculinity is the invisible wound of an entire generation. Men who were taught to be understanding but never to assert themselves. Men fluent in empathy but illiterate in instinct. They feel anger but disguise it. They suffer but smile. They want to scream but take a deep breath and say, it's fine. And in that it's fine, whatever authenticity remained dies quietly. Conscious anger, therefore, marks the return of the integrated masculine. It's the man who, after being drained by endless understanding, decides to stand firm. He doesn't want to hurt, but he no longer wants to disappear either. And when he allows that force to flow again, something shifts. His gaze regains presence, his voice regains weight, his energy is once again felt. Women sense this. Not the anger itself, but the power that arises when a man finally recognizes himself. Because feminine desire is drawn to presence, not passivity. And conscious anger restores exactly that, the living presence, the intensity that no longer asks for permission to exist. But there's a difference between expressing and unloading. The lucid man doesn't dump his anger onto others. He transforms it into clarity. He realizes that whatever provokes his anger is also teaching him something. That each time something awakens anger, it's revealing a boundary that must be asserted. Every repressed anger is simply an unspoken no. Once he understands that, anger stops being an enemy and becomes a compass. It points to where he lost his power, where he submitted, where he emptied himself. And by reclaiming that territory, he stops reacting. He starts acting. The inner scream that was suppressed for so long finally finds a voice. It's not a scream to the world, but a call toward himself. The need to be seen without justification, to be respected without explanation, to be heard without begging. Anger isn't the opposite of love. It's love refusing to die in silence. That phrase captures what many men feel but can't name. They don't want to destroy anything. They just want to be acknowledged in their giving. They want love to be mutual again, not a one-sided sacrifice. They want to love without losing respect. Anger, then, ceases to be a symptom and becomes a signal. A sign that something inside him still resists, still desires, still burns. Because the man who feels anger is still alive. The one who's lost it has already surrendered. Healing begins when he stops denying this fire and learns to channel it. When he transforms raw energy into emotional clarity. When he realizes he can be firm without being harsh, intense without being violent, truthful without being cruel. That's when he starts feeling whole again, because he recovers the part of himself that fear had silenced. Anger isn't the end of patience, it's the beginning of truth. And truth, when spoken by a man who finally listens to himself, doesn't wound, it frees. A man's true rest begins when he stops begging for recognition. After years of trying to be heard, understood, and validated, he finally realizes that power doesn't lie in convincing others, but in reconnecting with himself. And this reconnection doesn't come through noise, but through silence. A silence that isn't escape, but rebirth. When a man reaches this point, he understands that the love that hurt him most wasn't the one he lost. It was the one he gave without preserving himself. And that the price of loving too much is forgetting himself in the process. Yet paradoxically, it's in that forgetting that rebirth becomes possible. Because a man can only find himself again once he accepts that he got lost. Conscious withdrawal is the first step of this transformation. It's not indifference, it's cleansing. It's when he chooses the emptiness of solitude over the noise of dependency. It's when he realizes that being alone isn't punishment, it's purification. Because in the space of silence, he finally begins to hear his own truth after so long listening to what the world expected of him. Conscious withdrawal gives back to a man his sense of emotional scarcity, and with it, his magnetism. Absence makes him perceptible again. Rarity gives weight to his presence. He stops being the man who's always available and becomes the man who is where he chooses to be. And that simple shift in frequency changes everything. When he pulls back, the world feels it. The woman who underestimated him begins to wonder what happened, not because he disappeared, but because the energy she once controlled no longer responds. And that absence awakens in her the same mechanism he once lived through, the feeling of lack, curiosity, the desire to reconnect. But now he no longer reacts as before. He observes, calm, aware, knowing that scarcity is the field where consciousness awakens. The reborn man understands that true power lies in being felt, not explained. He no longer justifies his decisions. He doesn't need to prove anything. His silence says enough. because the silence of a centered man is presence, it's energetic command. When he stops trying to be understood, his vibration starts to be perceived on another level, and that's what makes him magnetic again. The power of conscious withdrawal lies precisely in reversing the emotional game. For years he thought he needed to insist to maintain. Now he understands that maintaining isn't about holding on, it's about sustaining his own vibration. And when that vibration stabilizes, the bonds that are meant to stay remain by resonance, not effort. The rest naturally dissolves. Emotional scarcity in this sense isn't manipulation, it's selective presence. The man doesn't need to hide to be desired. He simply no longer spreads himself thin in places that drain his energy. He has learned the value of being whole where he truly wants to be, and that integrity is what makes him rare. From this point on, silence stops being defensive and becomes affirming. It's not the silence of someone afraid to lose, but of someone who no longer needs to prove his worth. Silence becomes sacred territory. He no longer reacts to provocations, tries to correct misperceptions, or seeks understanding, because a man who has learned to listen to himself no longer needs to be understood by everyone. The power of silence lies in how it reorganizes the emotional field. While the noise of need creates resistance, silence creates attraction. While the man who begs becomes predictable, the man who observes becomes enigmatic. And mystery, when born from authenticity, is the purest form of magnetism. In this new state, the man rediscovers desire, but differently. Desire ceases to be a quest for validation and becomes an expression of life. He begins to desire himself again, to desire his own peace, his own rhythm, his own time. And it's in this reunion with his own pleasure that he becomes desirable again. Because a man vibrating in the frequency of his own contentment is naturally magnetic. He no longer needs pain to feel alive, no longer needs to prove he deserves love. Love now is a consequence of who he has become, and what used to be lack has turned into awareness. He understands that every loss prepared him for this new version, calmer, more selective, more centered. The silent rebirth is, therefore, the man's return to his own axis. He stops orbiting around others' emotions and begins to revolve around his own truth. From that point on, everything changes. Relationships stop being attempts and become choices. Desire stops being fear and becomes expression. Presence stops being performance and becomes essence. Masculine energy, when cleansed of the need for approval, regains its weight. Not the weight of control, but the weight of stability. It's the kind of energy that doesn't need to prove itself. It's simply felt. And that quiet presence restores a man's emotional authority, not because he imposes it, but because he radiates it. The reborn man isn't cold, he's conscious. He feels everything, but doesn't lose himself in anything. He knows when to approach and when to withdraw. He knows when to speak and when to let silence express what words cannot. He knows that it isn't absence that kills a bond, but inauthenticity. And now, he only stays where he can be whole. True rest comes from that, not from sleeping more or escaping the world, but from no longer carrying the weight of proving himself, from no longer needing to save anyone, heal anyone, or convince anyone, from finally being able to breathe inside his own skin. It's the peace that comes when he stops fighting his sensitivity and begins to honor it. In the end, the man who was once emotionally exhausted discovers that love didn't destroy him. It was the attachment to illusion that consumed him. He learns that love isn't about carrying, but about coexisting, not about controlling, but about choosing, and that his true strength never lay in resisting pain, but in walking through it and staying whole. The silent rebirth is the crowning of that process. It's the moment when he no longer needs to prove his worth to anyone, because he finally feels it within himself. He understands that he doesn't have to be the savior, the understanding one, or the strong one all the time. He just needs to be true. And being true at this stage is what finally sets him free.